Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome to my live stream where I share every week on Tuesday at noon, New Mexico time, a chapter of my book, Losing Sight of the Shore, How to Live on a Boat Without Killing Your Family. The book has much more relevance now because I'm actually living on a boat with my family. This one is from our adventures on two boats, the Dawn Treader and Hakuna Matata, but we are living on a new boat in the Mediterranean. So that is quite an adventure in and of itself. Before I get started reading this week's chapter, which by the way is a very long chapter, so you may want to take it in chunks. But before I get started on that, I wanted to show you where I am at the moment because it's stunning here. And it's so cool that we have Starlink on board. And so I can show this stuff to you. So basically, let me see if I can show you the view from here. Yeah, amazing. This is Mallorca. We're in Spain. And this is an island, one of the anchorages around the island of Mallorca. So there you go. That's where I am. And I'm going to share this with you. If you all stick around if you stay with me through the whole chapter reading, I would be happy to answer questions or just chat at the end of this broadcast. I'm laughing because it's very hot here. Finally a breeze. I'm on the top deck of the boat. And so I was like, well, you guys are going to have to just take me as I am at this point, which is fine. I'm also laughing because I have my glasses, which I need in order to read my book. Well, this is my last pair of glasses because one of my pairs of glasses fell out of my bag into the water today. And I think it's like 40 feet down, maybe more. And our dive gear is not up to par, apparently. So my last pair of glasses so that I can read this next chapter to you. So without further ado, this is Losing Sight of the Shore, chapter 26, Medicine is a Mistress. When people learn that I'm married to a doctor, they often respond by telling me how lucky I am. And in many ways, they are right. I am super lucky, and it is a blessing to have a doctor in the family. But something that most medical spouses would never tell you is that it can be a royal pain in the rear, too. Actually, the one person who did tell me that before my beloved became a doctor was his own mother. Anne Brown Goldfine was married to one of the finest cardiologists in Tucson, Arizona, Dr. Sam Goldfine. When I met Anne and Sam, they were in their late 60s and still very much in love. They were two of my favorite people in the whole world. They taught me so much in the short time I had the privilege to know them, and they are both missed dearly every day. One lovely, sunny afternoon, almost 20 years ago, my mother-in-law and her friend asked me out to lunch. It was a perfect day for lunch at a lovely patio restaurant in Tucson, with quail families speed walking across the path, playing hide and seek with their babies. It was a place I loved, and I felt great to be with these two wise, wonderful women. Like Mom Ann, her friend was married to a doctor, and they were not just inviting me for a nosh. They had an agenda that day. My husband had just been accepted to the University of Arizona's medical school, and they knew what that meant for me as his wife. They said, "We know you're excited for Nathan, and you should be, but we think you should need to know what the future will be like if he pursues this dream of being a doctor. He will want to be home with you and the kids. He will love you and want to be with you." Sorry, I bumped it. That's what happens. The house is moving, so I frequently tap the keypad by accident, so I have to be careful. He will love you and want to be with you, but frequently, more frequently than you can imagine, he won't be. You will have dinner waiting for him, or you will have plans, and he just won't be there. He will still love you, and he will tell you he wants to be with you and the kids, but he will choose not to be home time and again because medicine is a mistress. I often think of this sage advice when I find myself grumbling about the fact that my husband is gone or that some other career issue has kept him from being home. I know that grumbling about this out loud is ill advised and comes off as selfish because, really, how can you want your husband to be home instead of saving lives? People have been known to say, well, you shouldn't have married a doctor. But the fact is, I didn't marry a doctor. I married a mechanical engineer, which, as it turns out, when you live on a boat, is often just as valuable as having a doctor on board, except when you really need a doctor. In my opinion, being on a remote island or on a boat away from shore is far superior to living your life in a big, crowded city, almost all of the time. But when there is a medical emergency, it is generally the last place you want to be. I think if any issue prevents more people from ever really losing sight of the shore, it is this: fear of a medical emergency without access to adequate care options nearby. Yet lots of people do live on remote islands or boats away from medical facilities in potentially dangerous environments. Far from helpless, island people and boat people, not to mention RV people, mountain people, and rural people, are generally very resourceful. They find ways to get what they need when they need it. They find creative solutions that city folks might not think of. They might have a clinic which shares a nurse once a week with neighboring islands. They might take a water ferry across to the big island for regular checkups. In an emergency, they might need to fly somewhere to get help. Or if they are lucky enough to live in a place like Hopetown, they might make a VHF radio call to Basra. The Bahamas Air Sea Rescue Association, or BASRA, is a bunch of very cool volunteer badasses who stand ready to help in an emergency. When we were living on Hakuna Matata, Nathan connected with some members of Basra in Hopetown, and they asked if they could call on him in an emergency, since none of the other members on the team at the time were physicians. Of course, he said yes. Basra was right up his alley, combining his love of medicine with his love of adventure in order to help others. So it was that one night, the fastest moving rubber boat I have ever seen pulled up to the dock beside Hakuna Matata and whisked my husband off into the dark of the Sea of Abaco, heading to the scene of a medical emergency. Since most of what I remember about that night centers around my fear that my husband and our only captain might not return safely to our little boat on an island where we barely knew anyone yet, I asked Nathan to share what he remembers of that experience. This is what he remembers 10 years later. I went to the little clinic on Hopetown just to introduce myself to the nurse and to tell her that if she ever needed some help, emergently or whatever, she could contact us by radio. She said that I should contact Basra to make sure they also knew they could contact me in an emergency. I did so, and the offer was well received. So I helped out on various little things around the island. Generally, what would happen is they would call for Hakuna Matata on the VHF radio to reach me. On that particular night, we were already asleep and didn't hear the call on the radio. They pulled up their boat and told me they had an elderly couple on a boat and a man was altered in some way, but they didn't know what was wrong with him. They asked if I could assist. I said sure, grabbed my gear, and hopped on. Then we flew down the bay to the boat and were met by an elderly lady who said her husband had not been feeling well and now was acting strangely. After talking to him, I realized that he had run out of his hypertensive medicine and hadn't been taking it for over a month. I examined him and found that his systolic blood pressure was over 200. So I gave him some IV medicine to lower it, and then we transported him across the bay to Marsh Harbor for further care. Another incident was when a local woman that lived on the island her whole life had refused to leave the island for any medical care, even though she really needed it. She had not been feeling well and had not been able to get out of her recliner for 2 weeks. She was being treated by the local EMT for dehydration. Unfortunately, she was getting worse, not better. So he asked me to go by and see her. After examining her, I didn't think it was dehydration, but heart failure. The patient refused to leave for treatment, so he had to treat her on island with medication and put her on fluid restrictions. This seemed to help her improve quite a bit. By the next day, she was out of her chair and walking around, but still refused to seek any further medical care or testing. In other words, although he never would say as much himself, Nathan was making a real difference there. If you read Nathan's description with a low-level feeling of either nausea or panic over his descriptions of things like systolic blood pressure and heart failure, then chances are good that you are from the not-so-medically inclined set like me. Obviously, having a doctor on board can help ease fears, especially when you have one like my husband, who made sure we were well-stocked with emergency medicines and supplies. If someone had an allergic reaction to a bee sting and needed an EpiPen, we had that. If someone cut themselves on a dive knife and needed stitches, Nathan could have handled that too. We had everything from antihistamines to scopolamine patches. We were prepared. Gratefully, the Don Treader's crew rarely had to use more than topical antibiotics and some Band-Aids. But there have been a few times during our liveaboard lives that we all celebrated the fact that medicine is my husband's mistress. The one that stands out the most for me is the case of Cavalli House. Well, not since I'm here by myself and nobody's actually watching, I'll just start there. We'll fix that in post, as they say. The one that stands out the most for me is the case of Cavalli House. While not the result of an acute illness or accident, the Cavalli House incident was an emergency nonetheless. It happened on New Year's Day when I was feeling a bit groggy after hosting a fun party with dozens of other cruisers aboard the Don Treader the night before. Plus, the mischievous Rumpelstiltskin had arrived on board in the wee hours of the morning to fill shoes our kids left by the cabin door with toys and candy. It was a family tradition that I introduced them to when they were younger, and which I frequently regretted the morning after New Year's Eve. As the kids unwrapped their treasures and I guzzled coffee in a futile attempt to fully wake up, we did what we did every morning in Georgetown's Elizabeth Harbor. We listened to the Cruisers Net on the VHF radio. On this particular morning, we were in Georgetown quite unexpectedly. 2 days earlier, we had begun our planned sail to Puerto Rico on a super rare, perfect weather window for a long passage, only to have to return to Georgetown for better reception to take a last-minute phone call from our insurance agent. That was as far as we ever went, because the phone call was to inform us that we did not have coverage to go to Turks and Caicos, Dominican Republic, or Puerto Rico. Furthermore, it was a Friday before New Year's Eve weekend, and although it was morning in the Bahamas, it was already afternoon at our insurance company's headquarters in London, and everyone had already gone home for a long holiday weekend. The soonest we could try to add a rider, which would potentially allow us to sail beyond the Bahamas, was Tuesday. By then, our perfect weather window would have already slammed closed. As we returned to the anchorage in Elizabeth Harbor, my daughter Ahava, our nanny Lauren, and I felt devastated. I actually cried, which is pretty rare for me. I cried knowing that it likely marked the end of my long-distance sailing dreams on the Don Treader, and suspected it might even be the beginning of the end of this live-aboard life altogether. Over and over again, I asked myself, why? Why did we come this far only to be stopped short just when we finally had worked out so many of the issues on our boat? Why couldn't we join the other kid boats that would go on to the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and beyond? Why were we stuck in Georgetown? But later on that New Year's Day, when we were at Chat and Chill with other cruisers and sharing the story of how my husband saved a man's life in a pretty miraculous way, I had my answer. We didn't sail to Puerto Rico because Nathan needed to be right there, right then. When the call came out on the Cruisers Net that morning, it began as someone asking if anyone had a wheelchair that the caller could borrow. According to the caller, one of Stocking Island's most beloved residents had been diagnosed with Lyme's disease and needed help walking. They also asked if anyone had a certain kind of antibiotic on board. We did have these antibiotics on board, but Nathan doesn't prescribe medicine without seeing a patient first. At first, he planned to stop by to see the guy later that day, since he and Ziva were already dressed and just about to head to Chat and Chill for their usual game of competitive beach volleyball with other cruisers. But something about the way the symptoms were described over the radio sent up a red flag in Nathan's brain. I remember him saying, either they're full of crap or there is something else going on here. He remembers me asking him to go over there first and just be a little late to volleyball. They never made it to volleyball that day. Since he was heading to a medical call, and because Ahava is much more able to handle medical issues than Ziva or I, Nathan took Ahava with him on the dinghy ride over to Hole 3 and the Cavalli house. In the days that followed, the details of what happened that morning came to light. If you ask me, what happened was nothing shy of miraculous. Here's how Ahava remembers the scene from that life-altering day. We got the call on the radio, and then we drove there on the dinghy. We stopped to see the man's friend on a boat first to see what he could tell us. Then we went to his house, and he was in the shower. Daddy wanted to go check him out while Daddy went to go check him out while I stayed in the main living area with the 2 kids and his wife. He wanted to go to the couch, but he couldn't walk. He got down the stairs by leaning on his friend and letting him half carry, half drag him on his back to the living room. They were talking with them in there about how bad it was. The wife was convinced that it was Lyme's disease, but Daddy was positive it was more than that. Later, Daddy called his doctor on the island to have him bring some medicine. He came and agreed with Daddy's assessment. The whole thing took a long time, like 10 hours. Eventually, the family agreed to let Daddy have him flown out to the hospital in Miami. They used a makeshift stretcher made out of bed sheets to transport him, kind of like a hammock, 6 or 8 guys carrying it. They didn't want to move him too much for fear of making it worse and instantly paralyzing him. They carried him onto a dinghy, which went to another dock on the Georgetown side, where they carefully took him off, and there was an ambulance waiting for him. They drove him to the airport, not a commercial flight. The flight crew was almost off shift and diverted to pick him up. Then I went with his friend, who made sure I got home safely. Eventually, I became a mother's helper for that family for 10 days while the husband was in the hospital in Miami. Everyone agreed that Daddy saved the man's life. That is the quick version of what happened from an almost 13-year-old's perspective. I'm sure it's an experience she will never forget. That day left an impression on Nathan, too. Here's his perspective about what happened that New Year's Day in Georgetown. We were listening to the Cruisers Net toward the end of the day. They asked if there was anyone who needs some help. Lady gets on and says, "My husband has been diagnosed with Lyme's disease, and I need someone to help me. It has progressed so fast that he is not able to walk." I, of course, said to my wife, "They are full of crap. There is no way that this is Lyme's disease, and I'm not going to answer that call." My wife tells me to go over there anyway, just to make them feel better. I did have some doxycycline, but I doubted very much that they hadn't already treated it if I was wrong, and it was Lyme's disease. So I loaded Ahava up in the dinghy and put on my volleyball shorts. Another boater got on the radio and asked me to stop by his boat first. He explained a bit of the history and said they thought there was something strange going on there and asked me to be careful of what you are getting into. I went over there and introduced myself. The wife came up and brought us into the house. She told me that he had Lyme's disease and had been treated in Nassau by the doctor there. He had also just been seen earlier that week by his local physician. When we arrived, Robert was in the shower and another friend was there assisting him. I went in to try to talk to him through the wall, and he spoke fine, acted fine, and was very lucid. Then he told me the history where he started out with a chest pain that radiated across his back and chest, had some weight loss and some weakness in his legs that would come and go. He had nonspecific pains in his lower body that I knew were neuropathic pain, which means caused by nerves, and he went to several doctors and was ultimately diagnosed and treated for Lyme's disease, but he didn't feel any better. His friend Carrie dragged him from the shower to the couch so I could examine him and question him better. He also mentioned that he had difficulty urinating and had some abnormal labs. So I examined him in the living room and realized that he had lost some sensation at T4, T5, thoracic region, level 4 or 5. This obviously made me worry. Clearly, something had affected his spinal cord in that specific location. Then I received his labs, and he had a very elevated PSA, prostate specific antigen, along with an elevated alkaline phosphate, which is an indicator of bone breakdown. So I put two and two together and realized he probably had a mass pressing on his spine from prostate cancer and that this was a surgical emergency. I immediately had him lie down on the couch and not move anymore at all. I then called his local physician and asked him to bring the medication that I needed for this new diagnosis of a tumor on his spine. The physician initially did not believe me, but he agreed to come over and evaluate the patient, despite the fact that it was New Year's Day. That's when I gave him an IV and got on the phone to try to arrange for an emergency flight to the hospital. It is long. I told you it's a long chapter. Before Nathan continues his story of what happened next, it should be noted that there is a big difference between being a doctor and being a one-man medical unit. In a normal hospital setting, when handling a critical patient, Nathan would have a team ready to fulfill his every request. Hospital staff might be inputting insurance information, while nurses gathered important health-related data. If the case requires more advanced medical care than his rural hospital can provide, he can order transportation to a higher level care facility, and then a team goes to work to get him that transport as quickly as possible. As the physician in this chain of events, Nathan is free to focus solely on determining the patient's needs and not on the process of addressing those needs. Not so on a remote tropical island. For starters, there isn't an ambulance to take you to the closest hospital. The closest hospital is on another island, with limited capabilities. In this case, the patient was in a house on a hill on an island and unable to walk. Just to get him to a boat that could take him to the airport for a life flight was a challenge. But if I have learned anything about people who live on islands, whether on small Bahamian islands during a medical emergency or a larger island like Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, it is that they are incredibly resourceful and creative. Using nothing more than some bed sheets, Nathan and several of Robert's closest friends helped carry him from the house, down the hill, and into the boat for transport. Here's how Nathan described what happened after he decided the patient needed a transport. I spent hours trying to make the arrangements, starting with Blue Cross Blue Shield, wasting at least an hour on the phone with them, just trying to get through to a human. I then passed this off to one of his friends to try to contact the insurance company. Then his local physician showed up with the medication. They didn't have the exact medication I wanted, but this is to be expected on a remote island, so I called my hospital in Alamogordo, New Mexico, to speak to a pharmacist to determine the appropriate dose of the alternative steroid. After evaluating the patient, the local physician quickly agreed with my assessment and assisted with administration of the medicine. He also later helped with transportation from the dock to the airfield. I was then on the phone to a neurosurgeon friend to ask him if he could accept the patient, but he was no longer working at Mayo, meaning Mayo Clinic, and suggested I call the University of Miami. I then contacted Hospital, and they said I had to talk to the emergency physician, and they agreed with my assessment and would accept the patient if I arranged transport. I then called AMR, which was owned by our parent company, Envision, to see if they had any aircraft available to fly for emergency transportation. They said all of their aircrafts were in California, and they had no one available until after the holiday. They suggested I contact an island-based aircraft and gave me the contact information. I contacted them, and they said their aircraft had just dropped a patient off at Miami, and they were done for the day and heading back. After convincing them that it was an emergency and I was out of options, they then called the flight surgeon who was in charge of it. I talked to the flight surgeon and he agreed that it was an emergency. He said that his pilots only had 3 hours of flight time before they had to go off duty. He asked, "How long will it take you to get him to the airport?" They had to pick him up within 1 hour or he wouldn't make the flight. I said he would be there within 1 hour, even though I had absolutely no idea how I would get him out of his house and off the island. I also had I also had to fax over a bunch of medical information to justify the transport. Then I asked his friend to make a call on the VHF radio for somebody with a boat and some manpower to assist with sheeting the patient off the couch, down the hill, into the boat, and to the dock on the other side. So a bunch of people showed up with a boat, and we wrapped sheets around the patient to move him in a reclined position that he needed to stay in to prevent him from being paralyzed. The local physician had called ahead to convince the ambulance driver to take us from the dock to the aircraft. But when we got there, he was hesitant to transport the patient. Not sure why, perhaps because it didn't look like an imminent emergency because he wasn't bleeding. Eventually, he agreed to transport him for $200 in cash. They loaded him up, and the doctor and I went in the ambulance with him as it drove across the island to meet the aircraft. About 5 minutes after our arrival, the aircraft landed. Robert, the patient, and I then signed all the necessary paperwork, and he was loaded on the aircraft. 30 or 40 minutes later, he was in Miami. That evening, the emergency doctor called me to inform me that neurosurgery had confirmed my diagnosis and scheduled him for emergent surgery. So, less than 24 hours after the call on the VHF radio about Lyme's disease, Robert was under the knife. By all accounts, the surgery was successful, and a member of the neurosurgery team called Nathan a few days later to say that if Robert had not been life-flighted out when he was, he definitely would have been paralyzed. Mind you, that is not to say that the surgery solved all his problems, and he had a crazy amount of work ahead just to walk again. But at the time of this writing, he reports being happier than he has been in years and enjoying time with his kids and a new lease on life. For me, now 11 months later, I look back on that day with amazement, not just because of the medical miracle that happened on that tiny island that day, but because of all the little miracles that had to happen in order for this particular doctor to be listening to this particular radio call in that particular harbor on that particular day. Nathan may enjoy telling people that living on a boat was his wife's midlife crisis, but I have to wonder if the yearning that pushed me to push for that adventure was more than just fulfilling my own desires, but also helping my whole family, Nathan included, fulfill our greater destiny. If I had any doubt, this became crystal clear to me when Nathan received a text from Robert a few months later telling him that he was going to go for a run on the beach back on Stocking Island. It reminds me of a scene from the movie Field of Dreams where Kevin Costner's character, Ray Kinsella, is lamenting the fact that Doc Moonlight Graham had to give up his dream of playing baseball. Ray Kinsella: 50 years ago, for 5 minutes, you came this close. It would kill some men to get so close to their dream and not touch it. God, they'd consider it a tragedy. Dr. Archibald Moonlight Graham: son, if I'd only gotten to be a doctor for 5 minutes, now that would have been a tragedy. Like Moonlight Graham, who also happened to be a physician, I know sometimes you have to give up your dreams to discover your destiny. When it came to that fateful day in Exuma, Bahamas, we were all glad that my dream of sailing to Puerto Rico was put on hold that week so that Nathan could fulfill part of his destiny. And that is chapter 26, Medicine is a Mistress. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was super long. I was like almost losing my breath as I was reading, but what a story. And we kept in touch with Robert and his family for many years. He lived many years longer. He passed away just maybe 2 years ago. So I'm sad to say he's no longer with us, but I know that his family very much appreciated Nathan and our family for saving his life. And he gave me permission to share his story in my book. So that's why I shared so much in detail, because it felt like something, sometimes you think about like, how do you make this happen? And it does seem a little crazy if you overthink living on a boat or pursuing your big dream, whatever that might be. A lot of times you can stop yourself because it seems overwhelming and impossible. But when you just allow yourself to follow your joy and pursue the thing, whether it's for you or for your family as well, I feel like miracles happen. And that was an example of what I believe was definitely a miracle. So that's our little story about Nathan and my doctor and saving his a guy's life. All right, before I go, since you stuck with me this long, I really want to show you this anchorage. I marvel the fact that you're able to see this, but it's almost sunset. And if you can see it, let's see if I can show it to you. Right behind me, there's sunset. I'll move out of the shot. You can see the sun is going down behind that beautiful mountain. Lots and lots of boats around this anchorage. They come in for, some of them just for half a day, some party boats, but mostly just lots of people on boats with their families on these boats behind us. And we went for a hike earlier today in the canyon between, kind of on the other side of those boats. So yeah, it's a beautiful place. It's been an amazing experience. And I just wanted to share that with you guys. I know it's, I'm getting close to the end of this book. So I have to decide, hey, Michael Miller, you're here. Nice to see you if you're still here. I have to decide what I'm going to do with this live stream after I'm done with this book. I've been reading, a chapter a week. Most of them are much smaller. So if you're still with me, I appreciate it. And we'll finish it out. Let's see. I just read chapter 26 and the book has 32 chapters. I will say that I have been diligently working on my thriller. And so I'm thinking I might continue sharing after I might share chapters or at least some of the writing of my thriller here on the live stream. We'll see how that's received. But for now, I just wanted to say thank you for being here and share a little slice of heaven with you. I hope you all have a great week and thanks for checking it out. I'll talk to you soon. Fair winds and following seas, everyone. Bye.